we created the human and we know what his own soul whispers to him, and we are closer to him than his jugular vein. So, some Muslims will preach on this verse by saying, listen, God is writing down everything you're doing. He even knows what your soul is whispering to yourself. There's no place to hide from God. Others will preach on it, and they'll say, oh, it says God is closer to you than your jugular vein. This signals kind of friendship with God, intimacy with God, God's love for you.
Welcome back to Religion to Reality, the podcast about living an integrated life. I am your host, Dave Plisky, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Father John Grobowich. This season is all about listening, and not just listening to voices within the church like we did in the first season, but actually voices from outside the church, from all over the faith spectrum. And right now we've been listening to voices in Islam. Over the last two episodes, we heard from Dalia Mogahed and Omid Safi, two amazing Muslim voices who gave us incredible perspective. And now we're going to hear from a Catholic who actually teaches and is a scholar of Islamic studies, and to help us contextualize what we're hearing in a Catholic context. He also happens to be very active in interreligious dialogue. It's a great episode. Let's get right into it. Today, we are joined by Gabriel Said Reynolds, who is the Crowley Professor of Islamic Studies and Theology at the University of Notre Dame, where I happen to be going right now. A leading scholar of the Quran, his work focuses on reading the text within the religious world that produced it, one shaped by the Bible, late antiquity theology, and a shared search for God. He earned his PhD from Yale University in 2003 and has since published widely on the relationship between the Quran and earlier scriptures, including the Quran and its biblical subtext, the Quran and the Bible, and Christianity and the Quran. He also serves as the general editor of the Yale Dictionary of the Quran and brings his scholarship to a broader audience through his YouTube channel, Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I think I'm sensing a theme here. Professor Reynolds has lectured internationally from Cairo to Oxford to New York City and was appointed by Pope Francis to serve on the Vatican's dicastery for interreligious dialogue, where he contributes to ongoing conversations between Christians and Muslims worldwide. Gabriel, it's great to have you here. Welcome to the show.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks so much, Dave.
So we were just talking before we started recording about, you growing up in Connecticut, where I'm based. I would just love to hear more of, your story, particularly as it relates to, your faith journey and all that. I'd love to just hear more about you.
Yeah, it's not a super exciting story, Dave, and you're supposed to start off these conversations with something like really catchy. I grew up in the suburbs in Connecticut, in West Hartford, Connecticut. I did, my mother, her background is from an Arab American family. So, she was born in Boston and her parents were born in Boston. But her father, so my paternal grandfather, his first name was Said, which is my middle name. So there was that kind of Arab American heritage. It's pretty common, actually. There was a wave of emigration of mostly Christian Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians at the end of the 19th century and really the first decade of the 20th century. So my great-grandfather was part of that wave. Anyway, that was kind of back there. We didn't speak any Arabic, so I was interested in learning Arabic. So that's connected to kind of my eventual interest in Islamic studies and the Middle East. My faith was, from my perception, or my perception now, kind of looking back at the context of suburban Connecticut in the 1980s, I was kind of in a typical place with everyone. My parents were divorced. My dad and my stepdad were Protestants, not really practicing. My mother came from a Catholic family. It just wasn't a big deal. It was kind of the soup, everyone, yeah, there's kind of religion around. You may go to mass or service or whatever. That really changed for me from two things. Maybe just say this much for now. Uh, as an undergrad at Columbia University in New York, I met a whole bunch of evangelical Protestants, and they were like, "Do you know Jesus?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they were like, "Do you really know Jesus?" And so those conversations were really exciting for me, with these evangelicals that I met. And then also after my sophomore year, I think, could have been after freshman year anyway, back in the 90s, I traveled to the Middle East for the first time and discovered Muslims who asked me kind of like the Islamic version of that question. They were like, "Hey, why aren't you a Muslim? You know, Muhammad just kind of finished the job that Moses and Jesus started." And sort of the public face of religion is just, super evident in Muslim majority countries. I was in Jordan that summer, and, in many ways, how people dress, the call to prayer. So those encounters with kind of very zealous evangelical Protestants, and then with Muslims in the Middle East kind of changed the story of my life.
That is fascinating for me in a couple of ways. Only partly because our stories just overlap so much in certain ways. I also, also come from a kind of a family of divorce where I thought we were very Catholic, and looking back, it's like we were barely Catholic, and just a number of those experiences you're sharing like really resonate. Also, just in coming into contact with evangelicals during college,
Mhm,
and actually finding really good community and engagement at a level that I wasn't finding in the Catholic community at the time.
mhm.
Um, didn't I guess I feel like I'm getting a sense of what would have happened if I had spent time in Jordan, which I did not do. But yeah, that's really so now you are an Islamic scholar. You've published a number of books on the relationships between Christians and Muslims and all that
Mhm,
kind of stuff.
mhm.
Like, how did you get started doing that? And what continues to motivate you to explore this territory?
It was a messy journey, actually, Dave. So, uh, I mean, I was in a place of like confusion, like multiple uh, ways of being confused, sort of overlapping in my life, kind of coming out of undergrad. So confused in the sense of my own faith, confused in my sense of like, what am I going to do with my life? Like, what kind of job? What comes next? I mean, it's like the nightmare of every parent, that they'll come out of some fancy school, their kid will come out of some fancy school with no real idea. What the heck were these 4 years for? I mean, I was like the textbook case of that, but I was also spiritually like really kind of confused. Even though I had these exciting experiences, there was no kind of resolution to them. The one kind of marketable skill that I had was I learned Arabic. So, by the end of college, I could speak Arabic okay. Spoken Arabic is really dramatically different from written or classical Arabic. So I could speak Arabic okay. The Eastern dialects, the dialects in the West, like Morocco, Algeria, they're quite different. I cannot speak those even today, but I could speak Eastern Arabic okay, and I could read Arabic pretty well. So, that was a skill, and I had all these religious conversations. And the dynamic or the intriguing thing about conversations with Muslims is that Islam, uniquely among world religions, has its own take on Jesus. I mean, there are a couple of smaller religions like the Baha'i faith and things that develop ideas about Jesus as well. But, basically, Islam is the other non-Christian or is the non-Christian religion that makes claims about Jesus, and they're dramatically different from what Christians say about Jesus. So eventually I applied to PhD programs, not with great enthusiasm, just I don't know what else to do. And I went on to study initially the classical Islamic literature criticizing Christian doctrines on Jesus. So that, yeah, I mean, that kind of background, I guess, from my time in undergrad manifested itself with my dissertation project. In the beginning of that study is the Quran itself. So the foundational scripture of Islam has some pretty intense, dramatic things to say about Jesus. Yeah, so I mean, that's in terms of my academic journey. That was the beginning of it.
Let's just jump right into I can tell that maybe because or despite of your journey, you have some profound respect for Islam,
Mhm,
which
mhm,
has made you want to really unpack this and try to
mhm,
become a dialogue partner from your own
mhm.
Christian perspective and worldview. So let's just talk about that part of it. I know that we automatically can go to what are the differences, what are the
Right, right.
issues, the problems, but what is the respect that you have for Islam look like? Like what has it done for you, maybe even to make you a better Christian?
Right. Yeah. Great question, Father John. And a principal, I guess, place for me to think through that is, in a sense, the way Islam has reminded me how how Christians, the way they live out their faith and they think about the world in the 21st century in the United States, how much that is affected by like things that have happened in the past few hundred years and basically in the West. I know it may seem like a strange answer. I do have thoughts about how Muslims practice their religion and their doctrines, their culture, but in a sense, like Islam simply by being different and really, Father John, in like an everyday cultural way. And I could give some examples to that, but just by being different, for me, that kind of led me to reconsider things that often American Christians take for granted. So, I mean, like, I'm not an expert on sort of like the Enlightenment or kind of the Protestant heritage of the United States or what happens in like 1968 and subsequently, with wave of different ideologies, some of which are anti-Christian. But once you kind of spend time in the Islamic world, you sort of think, wait, there's a whole different way of being human. And not all of this is like one side is good and one side is bad. It's just you begin to see that things that folks take for granted. I mean, maybe this is a silly example, but may interest some people. In most Muslim majority countries, dating is kind of a problem. Like young people dating before they're married, you know, that is like an issue. Many Muslims are not okay with this. If you're getting to know each other with an eye towards marriage, and you're getting together in a group, like that's chill, that's good, right? There's no danger of, something inappropriate taking place. But like a young person, like 18-year-olds maybe going out for dinner, mo like a movie in a dark movie theater, driving home together, like that's something that all Americans in the 21st century, almost all, like the Amish are not doing this, maybe some really trad Catholics also, but like basically, like my students at Notre Dame, they just take for granted that that's normal. Of course, of course you would date. Why wouldn't you date? Even if you're not interested in marriage. Yeah, of course, like why not? That's what you do. And it's a kind of an assumption that folks take, and I was the same way. Back when I was 18 in around 1990, 91, I had the same assumptions, right? So anyway, I guess that's just one example of um, studying Islam begins to, in living in, spending time in the Muslim majority world, it helps you not to take for granted assumptions, in my case, that I had about like, how should you be human? What should the culture be like? It may be that dating is better, a dating society is better than a non-dating society. I'm not taking sides or saying that people shouldn't date, but at least it makes you think about these assumptions. I don't know if that makes sense. Probably seems
Yeah.
like a weird answer, but that's really been one of the prominent ways where engagement with Muslims has affected my thinking.
It's interesting. It reminds me, I think, something that Jonathan Haidt mentions in passing in his book, The Righteous Mind, where, he came as a very progressive liberal person, spending time in
Mm,
India, and he'd walk away with this profound respect for all of the so-called conservatism of the
right.
religiosity because he could see that this was very extremely meaningful and that it kind of completely changed his own understanding of like this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad. It was just like, no, it's just a completely different container. And it's like, how can we just be okay with knowing that our container is just completely unique as this one
Totally.
is, you
Yeah,
know?
totally. And if I could maybe add on a bit to that. So, I mean, the case of dating probably is more a question of, say, secular ideas. I mean, it didn't start in 1968. My grandparents dated in the 20s. So dating's been around for a while, but it's not been around forever. If we went back to, I don't know, the France of Louis the XIV in the
Hmm.
late 17th century, dating for most people would not be a thing. But
Yeah.
there are other cases where we have particularly Protestant assumptions in the way that I think, I notice American Catholics are Catholics. So, ideas, for example, I mean, an assumption, even if it's not lived out, that being a Christian kind of means reading the Bible and loving Jesus. And that's kind of it, like the deep sacramental nature of Catholic tradition or a devotion to the saints, whether it's for their intercession or learning about the lives of the saints as a way of cultivating virtue. Those kind of like deeper, more intensely Catholic ways of being Catholic, which, were part of Catholic Europe, for example, for centuries and centuries. In the US, I feel like they've kind of been like not watered down. There's a better analogy, but, kind of overwhelmed by a lot of Protestant assumptions. So it's not only kind of like, anyway, I'm totally leaving the domain of Islamic studies and all of that. Just to say that, I've been more attentive through studying Islam and living with Muslims to the, this distinct ways in which American Catholics are secular in some ways and Protestant in other ways.
Mm. Yeah, it's a really great insight. Yeah.
Are there other, I mean, I'm very interested in just the other examples that you said you might have beyond just the dating culture. Are there other things that come to mind that have helped you kind of reevaluate your assumptions and help you to live more intentionally?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, just to give some examples from Islam, because I'm not an expert on American culture, American religious history. So, something that I know a little bit about with Islam. So, Muslims, for example, sort of the principle of Islam is fear of God. So, God is the judge. Your destiny now and on the day of judgment is in the hands of God.
And this is
Uh,
this is not like the like, no, we mean fear as awe. No, this is really like I am scared. Is that
Yeah,
what
that's
you?
a really interesting question, Dave, because some Muslims, in order to communicate the Islamic notion of fear of God in a way that won't seem too frightening or just strange, they might say, no, it's a sort of pious love for God. It's not really fear, like, you're afraid of, I don't know, a bear or something.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, I think what you said does actually get to the heart of how Muslim spiritual masters speak of the fear of God. Because the Quran and Islamic tradition is very clear that, our destiny is in God's hands. Uh, God is the judge. God will send people to hell or to heaven. Muslims would usually say something like, reward people in paradise or punish them in hellfire. So, but it's God who will do that. God also is the Lord of this world right now and intervenes in the world in an active way. There are different Islamic theological traditions, so this is simplistic in that I'm trying to give the main vibe, but it doesn't do justice to the diversity of theological positions. But as I see it, the main vibe is that even now, God can guide people, lead people astray. He can test you, even if you're righteous. This does not mean that God will kind of just allow things to go well for you. He might put you through difficulties as a test, even if you're righteous. So this sense of uh, God's lordship and subsequently or consequently our fear of God. Muslims speak about this sort of very, very naturally. Um, like there's all sorts of pious expressions in Arabic. So Muslims often, Christian Arabs tend not to say this, but Muslim Arabs will often say, La hawla wa la quwwa illa billah. There is no power or authority except in God. Or they'll just shout out, La ilaha illallah. There's no God but God. And that signals like, listen, I'm communicating my disposition of submission before the all-powerful God. And this has all kind of been instructive to me because Christians in the 21st century, American Christians, you know, uh, uh, it is a difficult theological topic because, uh, you know, Christ gives us the image of the Good Shepherd, and of course, that should be the center of our spirituality. But nevertheless, there is a little bit of awkwardness or avoiding the idea that one should be contrite before an all-powerful God. Um, that damnation is a possibility. I mean, I was speaking to my kid the other day who's a junior here at Notre Dame, and he was like, Dad, I really like universalism. Can we speak about universalism?
Mm,
Can we speak about that? So, yeah, and this is part of the Christian spiritual and theological tradition as well, the power of God, God as judge. And yeah, so I guess there'll be a case where kind of hang out with Muslims, they're much more comfortable in just speaking about those sorts of things.
mm. And do you find that that type of judgmental God Muslims find to be maybe more liberating or freeing because it seems to be very clear in their estimation that if one is to perform certain acts or if one's to profess certain things, that they are in some way in allowing the good graces of God to be in their life? Is it a kind of simplistic type of understanding that way? I mean, and I only say that
Mhm,
because I
mhm.
see that in a lot of Catholic spaces. It's like, well, we have the Ten Commandments, we have the
Right, right.
Catechism, we know how things work,
Precepts
uh,
of the church. Yeah.
the precepts of the church. You do these things, you're in good shape. Is
Yes.
it kind of like that, or like how integrated does it get into, say, just the real complexities of life and just really trying to understand where God is in very difficult situations and moments and things like that? Like how and I know that every person's unique and just like every Muslim would be unique in how they understand
Exactly.
that. I get
Yes.
that, but like how is it generally presented in
Yeah.
most Muslim circles?
That's yeah, really, that's a really important question. And I I do think there's a clear answer with the caveat, that you mentioned, Father John, that, there are different, I mean, each individual Muslim is different, and there really are different theological and spiritual traditions.
Sure.
Many spiritual masters in Islam um, are speak often about trust in God. That often involves um, dealing with difficulty or trouble by seeing that as a test of your own piety and diligence as a Muslim. So you kind of turn the lens away from why is God acting this way to yourself, and then ask the question, how am I going to respond with what God has imposed on me, this trial? So a spiritual master would say, don't worry about what God's doing. God is God. Think about how you're reacting to this situation. God might be giving you a test or trial and might be observing you right now. An interesting way of thinking about this is there's a verse in the Quran in chapter 50. The Quran is 114 chapters. Chapter 50, there's a verse which says, um, we created the human and we know what his own soul whispers to him, and we are closer to him than his jugular vein.
Mm.
Uh, it may not mean jugular vein, but it's always translated jugular
Hmm.
vein. Habl
Hmm.
al-warid is the Arabic. So, some Muslims will sort of preach on this verse by saying, listen, God is writing down everything you're doing. He even knows what your soul is whispering to yourself. There's no place to hide from God. Avoid sin. Avoid any possible proximate cause that could lead you to doubt or unbelief, to die an unbeliever. Be vigilant, right? Others will preach on it and they'll say, oh, it says God is closer to you than your jugular vein. This signals kind of friendship with God, intimacy with God, God's love for you. Uh, so, I mean, there really are these two different sort of currents in Islam. But I think behind or what is present in both of those currents is a kind of resistance to challenge or even question um, uh, if Islam is the true religion, if there's any, say, problems in the Quran, if there's any problems in Muhammad's life, that kind of investigation is often discouraged. The
Mm.
proper disposition of the believer is not to ask those questions. And you often hear Muslim preachers say, you might start by asking those questions, but then in a couple of days, you might be in a place of doubt and even unbelief. I don't know if that's actually on point to what you're asking,
Mm.
but spontaneously, my thoughts ended up
Well,
there.
but that's really interesting because, but that is really kind of predicated on if a person's born into this, right? I mean, like, it seems as if, like, if you're born into this and this is all you
Mhm.
know, then why would you spend your time trying to question it in a deeper way? If how would someone who is not born into Islam, you know, try to unpack why one would want to become Muslim? Like they would have to be questioning, like, does this make sense, or is
Yes,
this,
yes,
at
yes.
least from
I
my
see what you mean.
standpoint, so like if it's already ingrained, I could see you can get away with saying, don't question. I mean, it's the same thing that happens in Catholicism. Like, if you're born Catholic, like, why are you questioning these things? I mean,
Right,
like, you've been
right.
given a gift, so just accept the gift, almost that type of feeling. And
Mhm.
I also maybe think that it might be good to touch upon, maybe at this point, let's just talk about the Quran and and why is it such a sacred text? Because I think there's a different way of understanding the Quran from, say, how Christians at least understand the Bible,
Yes.
or maybe specifically how Catholics understand the
Mhm,
Bible.
mhm.
And maybe a lot of our listeners do not know the difference. They may just be thinking like, well, these are just, the Quran is the equivalent of the Bible. And
Mhm, mhm.
yes and no. Uh, so maybe that might be a good place to start too.
Yeah, terrific. Yeah,
Yeah.
happy to transition towards the Quran, and I think Father John actually that point is a great starting point. The Quran is not an Islamic Bible, and the Bible is not a Christian Quran.
Hmm.
Uh, yes, they're both books, and they can be sewn together into a codex, so you can hold them up one in each hand. Uh,
Hmm.
they both speak about God. Yeah, but I mean, functionally, so in terms of their contents, in terms of their function, and in terms of the doctrines about the books by the believing communities, which see them as scripture, like on all of those points, there are profound differences. The Quran is written for Muslims by God from a historical critical point of view. So, like when I'm teaching kind of a historical critical way, I would just say the Quranic author, whoever was the person who composed this book, and Muslims would totally reject this, right? But as an outsider doing historical critical research, I just say whoever composed this book intended to compose a scripture. So intended to compose a book that his community would see as the word of God and would use for ritual recitation. So this is not the gospel of, well, any of the gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. None of them are like that. I'm not a great New Testament scholar, but just to take the case of Luke, he says in his prologue, this is basically an organized account. I've spoken to eyewitnesses. This is, he even dedicates it to this guy, Theophilus. I'm gathered this together so that you can learn about Jesus. This is very different than the project of the Quran's author, who is giving his community a scripture which rhymes, which uses an elevated form of the Arabic language, so that the community will have something to pray with. So Islam comes after Christianity. Maybe we should have started there.
Hmm.
Traditional dates of Muhammad are from 570 to 632 AD. Jews and Christians, by this point, they had their books that they were praying with. For Christians, I think also for Jews, but I know Judaism less. That book, in terms of ritual prayer, um, was principally the Psalter, so the 150 Psalms. That would be at least kind of, for the monks and the priests in the East, that's what they would be praying. That's how they would be praying every day, reciting the Psalms, which is obviously still done in when people pray the hours, the liturgy of the hours. So I mean, that's a really important starting point. As I mentioned, the Quran rhymes. The first verses of the Quran by tradition, they're today found in chapter 96. Just give it in my bad Quranic recitation. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. I got one verse wrong there, but for the purposes of the demonstration, doesn't matter. Just to show that the Quran rhymes, and
Hmm.
so that's a starting point. The Quran is seen as so now theologically, Muslims would say that this book was given to Muhammad by God. So they wouldn't say there's a human author who wanted to create a scripture for his community. It was given to the community by God in order that the community could praise God with the book. So God is giving Muslims the book with which they will in turn praise God by reciting this book. So, yeah, I mean, theologically, functionally, in so many ways, it's different than the Christian understanding of the Bible.
Mm.
What you're saying now brings me back to something that Father John was alluding to in his question a couple questions ago, which was kind of centering around like orthodoxy versus orthopraxy. In the Christian West, the focus has been so much on belief, right? Right
Mhm,
belief
mhm.
is sort of what we expect, and of course
Yes,
there are especially the Catholic Church prescribes like we were talking about the sacraments and precepts and so forth, and there are expectations about what we do, especially around worship, but not around like every aspect. We certainly have moral theology to give us guidelines of what is right and what is wrong, but most of our actions in our life is not prescribed by the church, even though I think we would say our beliefs are. And I
yes,
just wonder
yes.
how
Good point.
Islam it differ is, and now you've said that the Quran is largely um, given not to. I mean, I'm sure there are beliefs that stem from it based on what you're proclaiming as you pray with it. But it seems like the purpose of it is to be used as a hymnal, right? Or I'm using a Christian term, but
Right,
or
right.
even a Jewish
Totally
term.
get what you mean. Yes, yes.
Yeah. So I just wondered, like, how what's how do Muslims look at orthodoxy versus orthopraxy? If I can foist those terms onto onto
Yeah,
this religion.
terrific. Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really insightful point, Dave. And yeah, I think hymnal is actually not a bad, it's obviously an analogy, so it's not precise. It's kind of in a Christian key, but I do think it's basically the idea I was trying to express earlier. And you're also right that the Quran definitely has theology. So it does develop a vision of God, much like, the Psalms develop teachings about God and Israel, etc. And it also has some sort of it addresses certain legal or practical questions that will be useful for the community. So kind of ways to kind of form the community according to norms. And some of the rules that folks will associate with Islam are stated in the Quran. The prohibition of eating pork, for example, that's in the Quran. Uh, certain, in general ways, certain rules about marriage, about divorce, about dress are presented in the Quran. So there's some of that, but there's not much. So it's not a law book. If folks may know that term Sharia, Sharia is a very general term. It basically means what God wants from humanity. There's no such thing as a book of Sharia. So, I mean, lots and lots could be said about that, but you did mention, orthopraxy, like proper conduct. So, the way Islam develops through the first centuries is very much, at least in terms of its kind of intellectual culture, that's very much shaped by interest in establishing norms for the community. And there are different reasons why that becomes a central task. I don't want to get too lost in intellectual rabbit holes or academic rabbit holes about that. But ultimately, sort of the full flowering of Islamic thought is that for most Islamic traditions, and it's very prominent in kind of standard Sunni Islam, the majority community of Islam, is that the relationship between God and humanity is marked by God's imposition of laws. And here we could say Sharia in a very general way. And so the task of humans is to sort out what those rules are for conduct, which can get pretty complicated, and then to actually be attentive to them and follow those rules. And by rules, this could mean just kind of ritual, questions. How do you wash before prayer? There's an Islamic teaching that you actually have to wash, do it, what's called an ablution before prayer. How exactly do you do that? Islamic law tells you. There's some differences, different schools of how you do your washing. Um, exactly what are the rules for dress? Can a man shake the hand of a female colleague at work? Is that kind of contact between a non-married man and woman allowed? And everything. Can you drink coffee? Can you smoke cigarettes? Everything it can possibly. What do you do when a piece of food falls on the floor? I mean, to very detailed things. Now, there are kind of different keys in which one can engage with Islamic legal teaching. So there are some currents, famously a movement known as Salafi Islam, and where that's kind of everything, like being attentive to every detail of your life according to whether God has permitted or forbidden such and such a thing. And others would de-emphasize that other sorts of Islamic traditions get super complicated because of cultural factors, political factors, and then theological differences. Um, yeah, and so I don't know, is that a way in which to really kind of show what's distinct in Islam vis-a-vis Christianity? I think part of the answer to that question, Dave, is it involves ways in which Western American Christianity has become not deracinated, that's the wrong word, but in some ways has de-emphasized sort of the norms which a church gives us. I think the gap in terms of what are the rules of religion seems further or greater uh, because of ways that the Catholic culture has changed. I think there is a fundamental difference on that question. I don't know. That's very, very vague, and maybe it's not interesting. We can go on to something else. But
No, but that's I mean that's the reality, right? I mean, especially if we include our Protestant brothers and sisters in this question, what
exactly,
orthopraxy even means for Christians is
yes.
very. I mean, it sounds like that's kind of what you're suggesting is true in Islam as well. That
And
it
I
can,
think there are lessons there, Dave. Just maybe one quick point. So, as Catholics, we have a Sunday obligation, and it's not if you feel like doing it. It's not your choice. Like God has imposed through the church, God has imposed this obligation for us to attend Holy Mass. We can look to Muslims, and Muslims would say, listen, 5 prayers a day, that's an obligation. God, through Muhammad, imposed this upon the community. It's actually not mentioned in the Quran. It comes from traditions around Muhammad, but that's like, you don't feel like it today, I don't care how you feel. That's your obligation. So there can be lessons, I think. Maybe there's a more graceful way of communicating them, but that we can learn from Islam on that
yeah,
matter.
no, yeah, but that's right. Discipline comes without the desire, right? Um, that's helpful. I want to talk about your interreligious work. What forms does I mean besides these books that you've written that I'm sure have been and helpful for people when you have dialogue right now this is a little bit different because we're a bunch of Catholics talking about it
Mhm, mhm.
but when you're actually kind of in dialogue with Muslims what form does that take and what do you feel like is the goal of it, if anything?
Like, for me, the goal is to disagree well and not to agree if agreement means coming to a common declaration of doctrine. And I think, most Muslim dialogue partners would agree on that approach as well. Um, I mean, I feel like the real kind of wave of interest in like finding the deeper commonality that is kind of the foundation of all great religions. Like people used to speak about that a lot, and there were different Catholic theologians as well, sort of had that vibe. I feel that wave is kind of past, and I kind of in this cultural moment, folks, both Muslims and Catholics, tend to emphasize more like, let me just learn about your religion, like how it works, and let me see its, coherence and learn from it without adopting it or without finding some place in the middle, where we'll both meet and agree on something else. So yeah, so disagreeing well. I mean, listen, Islamic doctrine on Jesus, for example, is really different, is significantly different. I mean, Jesus basically is just a step on the way to Muhammad. That's his role in salvation history. He's just kind of one of a whole list of prophets who prepare the way for Muhammad. And, as John the Baptist says in the Gospels, uh, I'll probably mess this up too, but, I must grow lesser and he greater, speaking about Christ. This is Jesus. I mean, Jesus basically steps out of the picture, just leading the way to Muhammad. And so, I mean, this is dramatic difference, obviously. So, yeah, I would say like that's the most interesting, dialogues which involve a Muslim speaking about Islamic teaching about God and humanity, about the angels, the demons, and the genies, a category that exists in Islam, about the Day of Judgment, also about ethical, moral questions, marriage, divorce, even ecology, whatever it might be. Just let me listen and learn from you, and then I'll see if I have something to offer my Muslim friend.
Do you find that the way that Muslims look at Jesus is a little bit the way that Christians look at Jesus from a Jew's perspective? And do you ever engage in Judaism dialogue because maybe you're learning something from the dialogue with Islam that helps us understand how they might see Christians or
Yes,
Christianity?
yes, yeah, terrific. I totally see that. Yeah, it's a really interesting way of thinking through it. I was part of a movement called scriptural reasoning, which involves Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Yeah, so lots and lots of scriptural reasoning sessions and lots of these kinds of conversations. So yes, although I'm not a scholar of Judaism, so uh, yeah,
Don't worry, this is a
don't trust any.
lay. Yeah, understood. This is a lay audience, I think, generally.
Yeah, no, but I think it's important to emphasize also how distinct the each relationship is. So let's say like Christians thinking about Muhammad, um, that's distinct, and Jews think about Jesus, or similarly, kind of Muslims thinking about Christianity and the Christian Jesus, or Christians thinking about Judaism and say the Jewish Moses. Yeah, I think they're actually qu quite different. And it is tempting to think, oh, Islam and Judaism, they're kind of similar. Just one uses Hebrew, the other uses Arabic. I think one should avoid that temptation. So theologically, they're dramatically different. I mean, in many significant, substantial ways. Uh, it's not just that Islam comes later or Islam uses Arabic. I mean, Judaism has its own story. It's like you have a neighbor on either side of your house. The person who lives on the right side of your house. Okay, they're next to your house. Person on the left side, they're next to your house too, but they're totally different. Their stories are totally different. So I guess I don't want to try to just kind of summarize the differences in a simplistic way. But Islam has its own coherence in the way it sees religious history. Um, Everything is about Muhammad in Islam. In the
Mhm.
end, it's all about Muhammad. Yes, Muslims acknowledge all the prophets before Muhammad, but the only prophet whose teaching is authoritative for how Muslims live their lives, how they think about God, their religious obligations, is Muhammad.
But a Muslim
So
wouldn't say that they have a relationship with Muhammad, right? They have a relationship with God. Is that right?
the majority tradition in Islam, 100% would put things as you just did. There are some differences there, and there is a very okay. So two things to be said before I get into that majority minority thing. Uh, just for all Muslims, you're right. Muslims would say God is Lord, Muhammad is a man. However, Muhammad is the greatest man who ever lived. He is impeccable and infallible. And because he's impeccable and infallible, and because God sent Muhammad to be an example for the entire world, look to him, do things exactly as he did. So the Islamic concept of sunnah refers to Muhammad's example, and it's Muhammad's example. He's the only one in the whole history of humanity whose sunnah Muslims are to follow. So he was perfect in his ethics. He was perfect, and he thought about managing his community, his relationship with his wives, in his habits with food or clothing. I mean, Muhammad is, and he had the ultimate insights about who God is. He's the first interpreter of the Quran. And there's a supernatural dimension to Muhammad's rule. So he's not just a normal human. Most Muslims, certainly Sunni Muslims, would affirm that Muhammad can intercede. So a Muslim who dies with unrepentant, grave sins can be saved from the fires of hell by Muhammad's intercession.
Hmm.
So sometimes in interreligious contexts, especially when Muslims are sort of evangelizing what Muslims call dawah, they will be like, listen, we're not like Christians. We don't deify, we don't turn Muhammad into a god. Um, but in kind of inner conversations where Muslims are encouraging each other, they will really emphasize that everything's about Muhammad. Maybe I should leave it at that and not go into the other tangent that I was thinking about.
Sounds a little like our dedication to Mary
Mhm.
as kind of
I think that's right.
the most holy of the saints type of
I
thing.
think it's a great analogy. Great analogy.
Hmm.
Yes.
What about the concern that many people have of, say, Islamic theocracy and things like that? Like, how much is that embedded in the religion itself? Is that what is considered to be ideal to have a theocracy to govern people? Because I think that especially given just the tension in the world today, I mean, one could be very critical of Islam because of that. So how does that sit with, if you want to say the majority of Muslims or just in general?
Yeah, terrific. Yeah, terrific point. And so the kind of the the threat of uh, creeping Sharia or some plot in which Muslims are hiding things now, to deceive us, but they're gonna, sort of at some point like show up and take over. There's a lot of rhetoric about that. By the way, and not all Christians think that way. I think it's important also to affirm just,
Hmm.
the own Catholic community, that there's so many generous and wonderful Catholics. Like my little parish in Indiana, has been active for years in welcoming Muslims to the community in different ways. So it's not that, everyone has these conspiracy theories.
Hmm.
Um, but maybe the most important thing to say is that like Muslims are sorting this out. Um, Catholics too, like this is a complicated thing for the Catholic Church. For centuries and centuries and centuries, um, in Europe, you had Christendom, in which the church had a central role in society. Anyway, I shouldn't go into that, but Catholics had to sort out, especially in the United States with a Protestant majority, what do we do with this kind of republic? What is our role here? And then eventually in Vatican II was American bishops, among others, who are really important in the document Dignitatis Humanae, which emphasized religious freedom and things. So, Muslims kind of analogous to that, but doesn't mean the end will be the same. Are sorting things out. So, maybe just two quick comments, and I'll leave it at that. First thing is important to note is that there are already, there's no good count, but maybe 10, 11, 12 million Muslims in the United States. I think the official numbers are a bit less, about 2%. So officially, like the Pew Religious Forum would say 7 or 8 million. I think it doesn't matter, but I think it's probably a little bit of an undercounting. But Muslims are in every state, every community, and can't generalize about all of them, but like there is no significant movement among Muslim Americans, even to start a Muslim political party. And there's no kind of grassroots movements that we need to work towards Sharia. It- what there is simply is Muslims who want to be part of American life, have a mosque as Christians have churches, put their kids overwhelmingly in public schools. In my public school district, Muslims are super active in the PTO and all this sort of thing. And then the other comment is to say that in Muslim majority countries, and it varies from country to country, there is a religious culture which is unlike what you find in most Western countries. So Islam penetrates all aspects of life. So if you went to Egypt or Pakistan, you would just feel this. So in the family, the question of honor and shame, which is often linked to more or less kind of questions of being a good Muslim or a bad Muslim. There are other parts of honor and shame as well. They're just constant. And so, for example, the news that someone, your niece or your own kid, God forbid, has become an atheist or even worse, a Christian, that the government is allowing for people to whatever open nightclubs or publish books which are anti-Islam, like that stuff won't go down easy. So that's really a different context, which there's just there's nothing like that in the Muslim American context.
I was wondering if you could speak anything of, say, mysticism within
Mhm,
Islam,
mhm.
and what does that look like? I always like to think that usually when we start to look at the mystical aspects of
Right.
religion, there's great points of convergence. So is there anything that you have found in your exploring of, say, the mystical dimensions of Islam that
Mhm.
can help us to think that maybe we are speaking something closer than different in those areas?
Yes, so there is a very significant mystical tradition in Islam that it's not just individuals isolated here and there, but is organized into what some people call confraternities. They probably could have said fraternities, but then they would have been like, oh, people are going to think of like college fraternities. We're
Hmm.
usually translating this, they're called tariqas in Arabic, which means sort of the mystical path. The people are on a particular mystical path. So yeah, it's organized movement. It's a minority movement.
Hmm.
Very few Muslims will self-identify as what these are called Sufis. So
Hmm.
very few Muslims today will self-identify as Sufis. So
Hmm.
I don't know how to put a percent on it, but very, very small. So there is that mystical tradition, and oftentimes folks in the West find that a good way to kind of connect with Islam, to study these mystics. And likewise, by the way, many Muslims become interested in certain mystical figures in Christianity as an easier way, maybe to engage with Christianity. But I do think, Father John, that there is an element of Muslim spiritual life, even just in the ritual prayer, which involves a full ritual prostration, which involves washing before you pray. That sort of physical experience, it's not, for most Muslims, it's not just going through the motions.
Hmm.
So some of the like the love for God that Catholics might experience at Holy Mass or in Eucharistic adoration, at confession, Muslims experience something like that in their ritual prayer. And I think there's a mystical dimension to that, the total surrender before God who created you, who will judge you, who's been merciful to you in different ways. So I would say, like daily in the ritual prayers, there's a element of mysticism in Islamic life.
Uh, you mentioned earlier that good interreligious dialogue with Muslims often means uh, good disagreement, and it doesn't mean. I think you use the phrase without adopting, the other's
Mhm,
religion, let's
mhm.
say. But are there aspects of it that can be helpful to adopt? Not from the dialogue itself, but from the Islamic tradition. I'm reminded of there's a part in Living Buddha, Living Christ by Thich Nhat Hanh,
Mm,
where he talks about how he loves giving talks in Europe, in big European cities, because inevitably at some point during the talk or the meditation, church bells will ring out, and he says instead of looking at that as an interruption,
mhm,
I
mhm,
like to think of it as a call to meditation and mindfulness.
mm.
And I thought that was a great way for him to kind of incorporate his Buddhism into a into a Christian sort of
Yes,
context,
yes.
and still be a better Buddhist for it. And I wondered if there's anything like that you've taken personally from Islam, and maybe been able to bolster your own Christianity, your own Catholicism.
Yeah, definitely. And the first thing for me in that regard, Dave, would be living out one's spiritual life every day and 24 hours a day, or as much as possible. So And, for many Catholics, even for church-going Catholics, you get religion an hour a week, or if you leave right after communion, maybe 50 minutes a week. And that's kind of it. And at home at the dinner table, you never speak religion. That was kind of my experience growing up, actually. Um, and for Muslims, it's just not how life goes. So, I mean, religion is just part of your life. Not with like, I mean, it depends. There could be folks who like Muslims who have a kind of judgmental vibe when doing it. But for many Muslims, you know, you're cracking a joke and then some religious reference comes in, even in kind of everyday expressions. So I know the Arab world the most, and kind of, Arab ways of habits of speaking about God in everyday speech. But I'm sure it's in Pakistan or Indonesia or other Muslim majority cultures, it's kind of similar. So, I don't know, someone gets a haircut, there's a religious phrase that you use. May God keep you always graceful. If someone looks like they're tired because they're mowing the lawn, there's an Arabic religious phrase for that. And then there's obviously, the ritual washings and the ritual prayers, which are done. So yeah, I would say that's something that I think can be applied in a Catholic key. I mean, you actually mentioned the bells there, probably the bells that he heard giving his meditation or teaching sessions in Europe were Angelus bells. Probably many churches at 6 a.m., noon, and 6 p.m., the bells will ring to remind people to pray the Angelus. Most people don't even know what the Angelus is. Most
Mhm.
Catholics don't even know it these days. So there is something of that in Catholic tradition. And there's interesting stories too, Dave, of Muslims who people who come from Muslim background have become Catholics. And that's one of the things that a lot of new Catholics from a Muslim background find missing in church culture in the West, is that there's not just this regular way of being Catholic in most Catholic communities.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I could imagine, for example, going to Protestant services, I found myself missing the Eucharist, and I
Mm,
can imagine
right.
a former Muslim turned Catholic or turned Christian missing the call to prayer 5 times a day or something like that.
Yes,
That just is
yes,
such an anchor, for the
yes.
faith. Okay, final question for you. Is this season for us is all about how can we be better listeners? That's why we're having so many people from cross traditions join us, and not just listening, but listening without agenda. So I wanted to know what your practice is like, and how do you listen well without agenda?
Terrific. Yeah. So I guess listening usually involves friendship. I think if you're not friends with your conversation partner, even as the other person is speaking, you're preparing your answer or response. So, yeah, and not everyone has the chance to have a Muslim, for example, as a neighbor, coworker, whatever, to develop kind of an in-person friendship. But I still think there's a way of cultivating a disposition of listening, which is akin to friendship. Aquinas says uh, to love is to will the good of the other. So even if you're, reading something from a Muslim, or maybe YouTube finding something from a Muslim, um, yeah, that might be an opportunity just to listen and not to think of the Christian response. And I think, Dave, for me, a lot of that has to do with living one's Christian life robustly so that Islam is not a threat. I mean, this is maybe a silly anecdote, but for most people, if I'm not going to name any particular group, but like if this or that sect of Christianity, I'm not speaking about like big mainstream Protestant denominations, just folks that people would usually call a sect, this or that. Like if they came by, like most folks, most Catholics won't feel threatened, you know. And but with Islam, people tend to have a feeling of being threatened, and that makes it hard to just listen.
Do you mean threatened like for their physical well-being, or do you mean like threatened in like I may be interested in this doctrine or theology?
I think, well, the first one I would phrase a little bit differently. So I mean, I don't think most folks are afraid that, the Muslim guy who works in the, Starbucks is going to threaten them. But like this vague sense that Islam is a political opponent of the
I
West.
see. Yeah.
Yes. And the second thing you said, that, Islam wants to convert everyone, Muslims want to convert everyone to Islam. Yes, I think, especially online, which is kind of turbocharged that whole thing.
Mm,
I, like my kids now are getting stuff on Instagram from Muslim preachers and things. And so that kind of religious competition thing is
mm,
present. So yeah, anyway, yeah, I think yeah, the goal is to listen as you would listen to a friend without already be coming up with your own answers. Otherwise, you will find it difficult to find the coherence which motivates hundreds of millions of Muslims in their daily religious life.
mm. It's been really a pleasure to have you on, Gabriel. I appreciate the time and appreciate all your insights, your scholarly wisdom, as well as your anecdotes from your experiences. It's all been just a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Glad to be with you, Dave.
What a gentle and beautiful way of experiencing the world, in completely situated in one tradition while being open to dialogue and participation with those from other traditions. I just really appreciate everything Gabriel Said Reynolds has been saying here. And I liked the scripture passage that he picked out to as an example of how different Muslims might read. I'm saying scripture, maybe I shouldn't. The sacred text example from the Quran about how God is closer to you than your jugular vein, and I just feel blessed that we were able to hear from different Muslim voices leading up to this in the last couple episodes. I'm not saying that Dahlia would have interpreted it one way and Omid would have interpreted it another way, but I do feel like we got to hear a range of voices just even with two people. And then, of course, we've got Gabriel here to round it out. Beautiful arc here. Hopefully, we've done some justice to just the project of listening to Islamic voices. But now that's going to finish our time with Islam. And next up, we're going to spend a couple of episodes with Hinduism. Please join us next time for our first episode with a Hindu, Anju Bhargava. Religion to Reality is obviously a podcast, but it's not just a podcast. It is also an interfaith monthly gathering online that you can join for free. We do this regularly, once a month. You can sign up at our Substack, religiontoreality.substack.com, or just search for Religion to Reality on Substack or on Google, and you'll find us. Subscribe, and like I said, sign up for the monthly interfaith gathering there. I'm hoping that it's a way for us to actually live this and not just be entertained by the idea. That's kind of the idea there. Religion to Reality was created and executive produced by me, Dave Plisky, and is produced and edited by Nick Stropoli and Connor Donnelly. You can find the show notes and other resources at religiontoreality.org. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.